afternoon and welcome to a conversation about race and the LGBTQ movement. I'm Alan and Ernest. I'm Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. I'm really pleased today to engage in this conversation with an old friend, somebody since I've known, I think almost 20 years now, when we both served on the board of directors of the National LGBTQ Task Force. Ernest Hopkins, and I'm going to toss this over to Ernest now, and he will introduce himself.
Thanks, Alan. My name is Ernest Hopkins, and I'm the Senior Strategist and Advisor at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. And it is a really great pleasure to have some time to chat with Alan about our current situation and how it contrasts with past things that we've lived through as two senior statesmen in the movement. I think I'll put it that way. I was going to say old queens, but decided to be more elegant. So now I've given us both titles. People can choose.
Ernest, you're nothing if not elegant. So.
Thank you. Alan and I were talking, and we decided that we would start our conversation out by our first memories of activism and roles in movement politics. And mine is really early. And so I'm a native of Washington, D.C., where I am working remotely at this time, and lived in the city in 1968 I was 8 years old, so that gives you my age. I went to school at that time. I went to a day school outside of the city, really not very far. Back in the 60s, it didn't take you much time to get out of DC and really be in farm country, probably about 40 minutes outside the city. I went to a place called Berry Day School, and we were bused. And I lived in Mount Pleasant next to the National Zoo. And a day early in April, much like other beautiful spring days, April 4th to be exact, the headmistress came into the school and into the school room and said that the students were being dismissed early and that we needed to get on the bus. And so we got on the buses, and no one knew what was going on. We noticed that all the buses had their headlights on, brights, as we drove back into the city. And my mother was at the school to pick me up. And we drove from the school to home with our bright lights on, because I learned later that was the way in which the rioters and the protesters would know that there were Black people in the car. And those of you who know me and my family know that my mother is very light-skinned. She's actually gotten darker over the years, but it was really one of those moments where I was literally made conscious in the moment of being fearful for her and what people might perceive her to be versus what she was, a physician at Howard University, coming to pick me up to take me home. And so we hunkered down that evening at home. I watched the television. We watched things pop off all over the country. But then later in the evening, also heard, probably 5-6 blocks away from our house, the infrastructure of our community being destroyed. We were out of school for a few days. I don't remember how many. But when we got back on the bus, we were able to drive through those communities and see the devastation that occurred. And at least in Washington, much of those community infrastructures were not repaired until very recently, like within the last 8 years or so. And so I found myself drawing very strong parallels to our current situation and that. And that's the thing that comes up for me most strongly in this moment.
Thanks, Ernest. That's quite a story. My story is a little bit more about my baptism in political activism. In college, I went to UC Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz, and this was the 70s, and there was a lot of politics happening back then. And I had gone to a few anti-war protests, but I don't consider that to be really movement oriented. I just was against the war, as most of us were in college at that point. And but later on at Santa Cruz, there began to be a movement around issues affecting Black and Brown people at the university. And I became quite involved in that. And we started organizing, and really, it was called the Coalition Against Institutional Racism. So we were kind of way ahead of our time, I think, in certain ways, as we often were at Santa Cruz. I'm very proud of being a banana slug. So we were organizing to hold the administration's feet to the fire about issues for Black people and Brown people at the university. And so we decided we were going to have a big sit-in, and we were planning this. And so we had a sit-in at the Central Administration Building. And it was very big. Santa Cruz is a small school at the time. It's maybe 4,000 to 5,000 students. And we had like 1,000 people there that day. And 400 people got arrested. I was one of them. It was the biggest arrest, the second biggest arrest in the history of the University of California, the first being the free speech movement arrests at a much larger institution. But I think what was interesting for me as I look back on it now is that it's what we would call intersectional activism. We were Chicanos, as we called ourselves then, Latinx now, and African Americans, or as they called themselves Black students back then. And we, the coalition was truly against institutional racism. We were fighting the Bakke decision, which was a decision that got rid of affirmative action at the University of California. We were fighting for an ethnic studies department. We were also looking to reinstate the Educational Opportunities Program, which is a program that served largely poor students, but was really focused on Black and Brown students. And finally, and this is quite early on, this is the 70s, we were demanding that the university regents divest of their holdings in South Africa. And so I really did learn, interestingly, the movement was, two of the leaders were me and a Latina lesbian. And we were very out as queer people, both of us. And although this wasn't an LGBT movement per se. And and we saw this again in the Dreamers movement, that a lot of the leaders were actually LGBT in the Dreamers movement. But what was kind of interesting, so, we went to jail for a night. It was not a big deal, but afterwards, I was very active in LGBT politics, or gay politics at the time, in Santa Cruz, both at the university and in the city. And friends of mine, gay men, said to me afterwards, he goes, "Oh, well, we heard about what you were doing." I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, when you were talking about the litany of oppression against all the indigenous people and the Native Americans and the African Americans and Latinos, but you never said anything about gay people." And I said, "Well, yeah, but if I was at a gay demonstration downtown, would I be saying this about, invoking all the tyranny against people of color?" And it just struck me that that there was sort of an expectation. So two things I learned: the importance of intersectional politics, and in some ways that you'll never win. There's always going to be this tension for people like Ernest and I, who may identify as being more than just one thing. And that there's always this balance between including people and being talking about your own particular issues, and I think it's really informed the way I've looked at my politics since then. And one thing I think I learned is you can only be who you are. You have to be authentic. And if you're a good person, just do the best you can. And the second thing is listening to people, because I think it was, one thing that I really learned as being in that movement was I learned a lot from others when I didn't try to have a response or judge people, just listen to what they had to say. So
that's fascinating. The first thing that comes up for me, Alan, is as a Black gay man, my whole existence has always been so intersectional that I'm always surprised, somewhat taken aback when I've heard over the years, and we've been in some of those rooms together, white LGBT folks wonder why race politics or social inequality politics around economics or other injustices or feminism are intersectional and a part of the LGBTQ movement. And we've had to bring people along in a lot of rooms on those issues. And it feels that if I could just point to a moment of progress, that feels like something that people aren't having to do as much anymore on at least most of those issues. And I think the one that is still outstanding could be race. That may still be the issue that people still don't quite have their arms around.
Yeah, I think, I'm sure you experienced this early on as I did, being in meetings, planning meetings or whatever around queer issues. And, the minute it turned to anything that was about people of color, they turned to Ernest and say, well, Ernest, what do you think about that? As if you then could speak for all people of color, because that would happen to me too.
Oh, yeah, we've been there.
Yeah. So, but I do feel like, at least in our two organizations, in the AIDS Foundation and the center here, that we've come a long way. I don't think, we're perfect by any means, but that we have come a long way to understand our intersectionality. It used to really bug me when people would say like the Chicano movement and the gay movement as, this sort of like, no, that's not how it works. We used to have that saying back in the day, Ernest, we are everywhere. And I always felt that was one of the really
great
one about our movement is that we were everywhere because we were everybody in that movement. And, I think we're more there now than we used to be, although we still have some distance to go.
So we're living in this moment of converging epidemics. We have many of our participants and supporters on the phone, under normal circumstances would be focusing on our efforts to end the HIV epidemic. We have the COVID pandemic, and both of them now are kind of impacted by the what many people describe as America's original sin, racism. And talk a bit about how you see the historical connections between HIV and the beginnings of HIV and the beginnings of COVID, and how race has played its role in shaping both.
Yeah. Well, I think as we perceived at the beginning in the early 80s, when we first started experiencing this very bizarre disease that was initially called gay-related immunodeficiency disease, GRID, in the gay community, it was, I think, largely seen as a disease of white upper middle class gay men. That's where we first read about it happening, right? We had no concept as what probably nobody did, but that this was actually an international pandemic that was affecting people all over the world at the time. But it got defined in that way, I think, very, very early on. And wouldn't you say that that's how people saw it at the beginning, Ernest?
I think it depended on how close you were to it. I mean, you know, in 1981, I was a junior in college in New York City. I lived in Manhattan. I was at Columbia and lived on 89th between West End and Riverside. So for me, as a buddy at the time at Gay Men's Health Crisis, when we first started dealing with it, we knew immediately that the disease was impacting a really broad and diverse population of folks. Latinx women, trans women, gay men of every stripe, injection drug users. It was clear. It was pretty clear to folks who had decided to engage in that way that it wasn't as the media had kind of portrayed it. And I feel the same thing is true around COVID. Is like the original message that came in the Black community, ironically in Black Twitter, was, well, melanin is a protector. You can't get it if you are Black. And we had some of our thought leaders begin to put out that canard until, of course, Black people started dying, and they started dying really quickly. And then suddenly what we saw was just the opposite, that not only were Black people impacted, but they were disproportionately impacted. And the ways in which the media and the political environments sought in both instances to diminish the impact of both HIV and COVID on the population, allowing it to spread because you're giving people false senses of security, and the ways in which they both, ultimately have had this really disproportionate and dramatic impact on people of color. I mean, depending on where you are, if you're, in the West, the Latinx community and Native communities are being hit really hard. If you're in the South and the Northeast, it's predominantly African Americans and Latinx. I mean, it's really quite stunning how both diseases have seeded themselves so significantly in our communities. And the inaction of the government and the ways in which we were misinformed have slowed progress and response in both instances.
Yeah. I do think, though, that in the early AIDS epidemic, this was it really does in some ways come down to class, because the people that had power and the power to, in the media and elsewhere, to sort of present what was happening, those were that was defined by class, and those are largely, upper middle class, upper class white gay guys, right? So we didn't see ourselves in that epidemic nearly as much because we didn't control the sort of the power that would make it visible to the broader population.
That's right.
I think it took a long time. This, at least in COVID, it has happened in a relatively short time, where they sort of turned this around, right? And say, no, this is happening to our communities at a disproportionate impact. It took a long time for that to be felt, I think, during the AIDS epidemic.
Well,
for the population.
The impact of COVID-19 on such a broad swath of the population has destigmatized infection in ways that HIV actually was never destigmatized. Right. It hasn't hit specific populations within the community, the racial ethnic community. So the fact that it was so predominant in LGBTQ communities and in injection drug using communities really hit home in a really unfortunate way, and allowed those communities to be marginalized in a way that actually impeded our ability to respond. That hasn't happened in COVID-19, and it'll be very, very important that we don't let it happen in the context of people of color, that we continue to lift up the importance of ensuring that folks have what they need across the country, regardless of where they live and regardless of their socioeconomic status. This division between service providers and essential workers and the provision of resources is something that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to and fight very hard to ensure everybody has what they need.
Well, in fact, we still have to do that with HIV too. We have to remind people that it's actually still an epidemic and still a disease that is killing people and having tremendous impact on people. It just, the community that it primarily is affecting in this country, of course, is young gay and bisexual men of color and trans women. But it seems to have oh, well, it's not really it seems the epidemic's kind of gone away now. We don't have it, but it still is an epidemic. Just focus more, and we have to remind people in the same way that you were just talking about that. Yes, this is still an epidemic,
and the infection rates are in the young, and the deaths are in the old, which is also a comparison that is very, very present between these two diseases. In Washington, we are seeing a very high number of African Americans infected, and the vast majority of folks who have died are also older African Americans. And I believe that's also true in the South, where when you look at the counties in the South that are predominantly Black populated, you see the highest rates of hospitalizations and the highest rates of death. And so the same things are appearing in both populations. And some of that is around the ways in which people have been able to take care of themselves over time. And when they encounter HIV or when they encounter COVID, what else they have on board already that impacts their ability to survive it and overcome it. But
yeah, and again, of course, it has to do with the socioeconomic status and particularly economic status of people that live in crowded conditions, or in the case of Latinx people who are working in the meatpacking plants and forced into these very, very tight spaces and really not allowed to not work. We see this at work in a really insidious manner, I think,
correct.
In some places.
So. Correct. Yeah. All things that we're in the process of trying to deal with at the federal level. My work has been at the federal level all these years, and it's really been instructive to have dialogue both with legislators and with folks inside the administration, both career folks and political appointees, to actually remind them that HIV, like COVID, exposed the fact that our public health infrastructures are very weak in many parts of this country, and that resources were going to have to be brought to bear in order to ensure that they didn't collapse. That's the origin of the Ryan White Care Act. That's the origin of the Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS program. That's the origin of the Minority AIDS Initiative. All of those things were put into place because our public health systems were unable to respond appropriately at the time. And so when we look at COVID-19 and these stimulus packages that are being put together, it's ironic that in a number of instances, those very programs are the programs that are being funded to support community-based responses. It's really a testament to the work that the HIV community has done, that we've actually created public health and community infrastructures that now are available to be used for COVID-19.
Yeah, it is, if out of that history where we sort of took to the streets and then also, but we're very savvy about creating these structures, right? Like the AIDS Foundation in 1982, I believe, or the Center back in the early 70s that created these service structures that worked by the time that HIV came into be the bigger issue in our community and broadly throughout the LGBT community. What would have happened without them that then also created the power to get the legislation passed that then benefited people, not just LGBT people, but all people in a serious way. Ryan White being one way. I think now that those structures exist, and thank God, because I think both of us in both of our agencies are seeing these are effective structures for dealing with this new pandemic as well. And we're seeing that here.
And when we get effective home testing for COVID, which hopefully will be out soon, it'll be the community-based organizations that people have pre-existing relationships with and who they trust as healthcare providers that will be in the best position to actually push that out. Not to mention the resources that have been invested over the last 30 years in vaccine research, largely pushed by the HIV community. Now that infrastructure is available to respond to the push for COVID vaccine. And once again, when and if we get the vaccine for COVID, and we certainly hope it's soon, it'll be the community-based organizations that actually will be best positioned to ensure that vaccine is distributed.
Yeah, another way it strikes me is the tracing of the infection, right? And that one thing that we have really perfected in our business is among STIs, STDs, is doing that tracing so as an effective means of stemming the passing on of the infection. It's just one more way I think that we've sort of built a structure.
One more way.
Yeah. Well, Ernest, I'm wondering if you are. What is your experience now as we've seen these last few weeks and this this sort of bubbling up of these issues that we've dealt with? I feel like every few years, we're dealing with these issues of racism in an intense and focused way. And then the rest of the time, we're just dealing with it as a reality that's kind of like an everyday thing. How do you feel this current situation is different or similar to what we've experienced in the past?
Oh, I feel exhausted.
Yeah.
I feel completely exhausted by the repetitive nature of it and the lack of learning and the lack of historical reference and kind of the inability of people to step out of their own personal circumstance to have empathy and understand what's happening really maybe right down the street or around the block. And then I juxtapose that with all the acts of kindness and support and solidarity that you see. And for me, that's very much been my history in both the movements that I've been involved in and also as a Black person in the United States. It's never black and white. It's always the gray. You live in the gray. You survive in the gray, is what I should say. And you find hope and you find paths to learning and enlightenment along the way. But the ugly parts on both sides, they never go away. We've never resolved any of that. So you find yourself trying to be as understanding as possible of both sides. I mean, I've had so many of my white colleagues reach out to me with, I'm just checking in to see how you're doing. And I really appreciate all of those reach outs because I understand where they're coming from. And it's a very difficult thing for me to respond to. How am I doing? Well, it's not good.
How do you think I'm doing? I mean,
there's nothing good I can say to you.
yeah.
I'm personally fine. And, my heart is breaking every day. My heart is breaking about something that I am reading or seeing happen to people on the streets. It's really heartbreaking.
And and once again, we go back to the disproportionate impact. I mean, we already felt, because of the economic issues around COVID, there was disproportionate impact on communities of color. There's no question about it. So you're already like under such tremendous, this cloud and this pressure of like, am I going to survive simply economically in this pandemic? And then this huge emotional and sometimes physical danger of it, but the emotional pain and danger that you're facing as a result of this coming together with that, it just seems, I think the exhaustion you're talking about is shared. And it's not just shared by people of color, it's shared by a lot of people who are facing a lot of these same challenges. But I think now, with it just feel like getting beat over the head with it every day. Not to mention the insanely stupid response by our federal government.
One of the things that has surprised me, I will say, you mentioned that Keith Ellison out in Minnesota, has upped the charges for the policeman who murdered George Floyd, and the other policemen who were his accomplices have also now been charged. So that's good news. That's justice in action. That's movement. But I do keep reminding myself that was one act of horror on top of several others. Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Ahmaud Arbery. Where was he murdered? That was in Georgia, but it wasn't in Atlanta. It was in another town in Georgia. There's just so much going on, and people are angry about so many things that are on top of each other. I wonder what it will take for people to feel that the point has been made and that they can go home. I don't know what that is.
I don't either. And I think the already the inequities that were being intensified by this current administration in every way. The way to limit poor people, Black people, brown people from voting, the way of taking away protections that the Justice Department used to protect disadvantaged, marginalized people from, all these things that are like have been mounting for the last 3 years anyway, right? And for brown people, the way that immigrants have been being, just brutalized and stigmatized, it came on top of all this. Even if you don't even look at we know that the systemic violence of law enforcement against Black people has been going on. It's not like this is a big surprise. It's just been a little bit more in our face in the last few weeks, right? But then you put that with this systemic erosion of rights and equality for these communities. It's just Correct. It's overwhelming in a way.
Correct. And the lack of leadership is most concerning, because that points to the kind of core issue that I was raising. Is I don't know what the fix is. Like, when will people generally feel that things are on the right track and moving in a direction that they feel is unstoppable towards justice, so that they can go home and socially distance and put on their masks and at least try to respond appropriately to one of the pandemics that we are dealing with. I'm just so concerned about people's well-being in the streets. If they're not being assaulted by the police, they could potentially be be being assaulted by this pathogen. There's so much risk involved in all of it at a time of great uncertainty and no leadership.
Yeah. I guess one ray of sort of brightness that I've seen in this time has been that I do feel like the LGBTQ community figured this out a lot quicker. That this is our community, and it wasn't like, well, it's not our issue, because you'd get that a lot, early on. Well, I feel about that, but it's not really our issue, And I feel like the transition was a lot quicker.
Much quicker this time.
And I think that's been gratifying, I think, as somebody who's worked in the LGBT movement a long time, to not have to. I mean, there has been this weird resistance to just the term Black Lives Matter among a lot of white people, and I don't understand it, because even among smart people, there's this, well, yeah, but, and I didn't, I didn't feel it this time. I felt like, okay, we got it, and I mean, it's sad that it takes this sort of brutal examples of this to make people get there, but I think they got there pretty fast this time.
Yeah. At the AIDS Foundation, we have a new strategic plan that centers racial justice at the core of our work. We're trying to end the epidemic in San Francisco and have done a really good job in a number of communities, but in Latinx and Black communities, especially those who use substances and who are marginally housed, still a lot of work to do. So if we're going to do our work appropriately, we have to really become much more conscious of what it takes to provide appropriate services to those populations. And so, too, I feel as if we're going to have a really serious conversation about what it takes for change, it's not for me to have the conversation. It's for the white people who actually are desirous of change to have a conversation with people inside their community who actually still are wondering what all the hubbub is about. Why are people so pissed off?
Yeah.
What happened? And that's the work, because I can't do that.
Right.
You can't do that.
Yeah, and it's also like, I know it's really, we all have thoughts about this, right? Especially, if you're like an educated person and you're analytical and political, you have thoughts about, but, I'm not really interested in your thoughts about my oppression. I'm interested.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah, yes, I'm interested in your thoughts about how you're oppressing us, and I think there's a lot more of that now, and I think that's good. And I mean, in our community, in our LGBTQ community, I think there's a lot more of that, saying like, no, we can't put this, we can't ask them for, like, they would turn to you and like, well, how do you feel about that? I don't know. It's not important how I feel, but it's how you feel about what you're going to do about it, and I think that's good. I think both the leaders of both our organizations, who are white, I think have taken real steps to try to take responsibility for that and make other people who share their skin color take responsibility for that. And I think that's a good
I agree. In very, I have to believe in moments where it's very challenging to do so, because we all grew up in the same environment, and it's not an environment that actually promotes equality, and so you've got to go against a lot of teaching and learning that you've either been provided with directly or that you've absorbed indirectly. And that's what I'm hearing from a lot of my friends is how this moment is making them think back and be thoughtful about how frequently they have acted on subconscious understandings, things that they understood they were supposed to feel about people of color, frequently Black people, and how ashamed they are feeling, how attuned they're becoming to it. And obviously those are the first steps to healing. You can't heal if you don't go there. And so it's been good to have those conversations with folks.
Yeah, and they are really, really hard conversations to have. I've noticed even in some of our meetings at the center, that they're painful and they're also very emotional, and that we have to get over this feeling like everything needs to be totally intellectualized, and that we're going to look at this and solve the problem. Some of it is our own pain that we're feeling as people of color in the LGBT community and as white people in the LGBT community, and not only not fear it, but to let us have a space to have that kind of emotion in ways that we're not really used to doing. And in some ways, I almost feel like the fact that all our meetings aren't in person, it makes it almost like a little bit easier. There's a little bit of distance you have by being in front of a screen instead of being in the same room with somebody where, you don't want to break down crying, kind of thing, where you have a little bit of distance to be able to do that. But I've noticed that already, and I think we need to encourage that among ourselves, not to be afraid to get emotional about these things.
Because it is emotional. I mean,
yeah.
You're missing some part of the point if you don't feel what's going on. You have to feel it because it's so visceral.
I mean, here we are, all getting on in our years, and we've dealt with a lot of these feelings for 20, 30, 40 years, and we've never really talked about them at work, in that kind of way. We talked about them up here in the head, but not really in the heart in that way. I think that's
yeah. No, and you dare not, because I feel like for those of us who have been doing this work long enough and have seen as much loss as we've seen, it's really very dangerous. It feels dangerous to kind of let the floods come and to really begin to deal with all of the loss. And so instead of doing that, we kind of push through it, and we kind of numb ourselves to it, and we, put our heads down and keep moving.
Because we got people out there. We have people out there that need the work that we're doing, right? Need the services that we're providing. So there's an interesting question that just came up from Facebook. Do you see that there, or I see it?
What have you witnessed in your organizations this past week to advocate for the Black community and condemn police brutality?
Yeah.
I know that we signed on to a letter that was circulated in the LGBTQ community amongst community-based organizations that went right to the heart of that question, condemning the overreach of law enforcement, honoring and acknowledging the right, the civil right, the human right for people to protest injustice, and also just acknowledging that it is absolutely at the core of our citizenship and our humanity. We've definitely stayed true to that. And so, not to mention that plenty of my colleagues are out in the streets. I mean, we know that, as you said, Alan, the LGBTQ community is everywhere, and we are very much a part of this protest as we have been in every other one.
I think we have gone through a lot of that same process as you were talking about. Lori Jean did put out a column quite early last week about this, and that I had referenced earlier. And we have been trying to with our staff. And I don't think you guys are either at the AIDS Foundation. I don't think we're parsing words here. I don't think this is like, no, we're saying this is systemic oppression by law enforcement of African Americans in particular and people of color in general. And we know this, and that's what it is, and we're calling it that. So I think that's one way we've been very, very forward about doing that. And then I think we've also been trying to it relates somewhat to what we were just talking about, the sort of emotionality of this and the pain of it that's very on the surface. We have been trying to communicate with our staff as much as possible to say, like, we know we're feeling this, we know you're feeling this, and we have to take care of each other because we're not going to get through this unless we do take care of each other through this. Because
we have to. And while we need to acknowledge the police brutality that actually fomented this last round of protests was largely in the African American community. Now that a diverse group of people are on the street, they're unleashing their brutality on everybody. I saw a terrible photo of a white woman who was received a rubber bullet to the face, right in the middle of her forehead. How and why are you doing that to people? Should that person is in the wrong job? That person should be criminalized and put in jail. That is assault. And we've got to acknowledge that too, is that these diverse crowds of folks who are protesting for justice and for racial equality and for socioeconomic justice and proper housing and all the other things that are on the table in the conversation, we all become a collective force to be combated against in the eyes of some people in law enforcement. And that has to be acknowledged too, is that if you're out there and an ally on these issues and you're not a person of color, we understand that you're putting yourself at risk, and honor that fact that you're fighting for a more just society, and that's what we're all about.
I also think that that LGBTQ people and organizations have really been a part of changing, in at least in some ways, police culture, because we have challenged it, both for LGBT people in general and also for people of color in our community. That we have done the hard work of going to police and saying, this can't go on anymore. And all these instances of you brutalizing trans women of color and doing this thing to various parts of our community, that we have sort of led in many ways this place that we seem to be getting to, where even police are saying this can't go any longer and it needs to be charged as a crime, and it can't be, that we're seeing a lot more, or some, just, I shouldn't say a lot, but we're seeing some progress in that way of police calling it out as what it is, which is just systemic violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We have another question here. Let's see. These disparities in crimes have existed so long. How do we leverage this moment to create real change? Well, that's kind of a big question.
It is.
Yeah.
We have a question about Liana Dior, who I believe was the woman who I saw. She had been in a car accident. I believe this is the right situation. She'd been in a car accident, and she was attacked on the street in front of a little store by a mob. And he was able to get into the store and be protected from the people on the street by the store owners, who allowed her to come in. And then, of course, the people came into the store and tried to pull her out, really in a horrible fashion. I believe that that's the case that Joey is talking about. It's just an acknowledgement that there's so much work to do to provide equality to marginalized populations. And my God, the one of the most marginalized populations in our community are Black trans women. There's just no question about it. There was a Black trans man who was murdered earlier in the week, but trans women are brutalized on a regular basis and murdered with far too much frequency across the country. I believe that Layana is okay. I don't believe they got to her. I believe she was protected, but it does speak to the marginalization that folks are facing in this environment.
Yeah, it kind of goes to this other question that I just pulled off of one of our Facebook viewers that said, how do we leverage this moment to create real change? I think that is the question. So how do we make sure that for people like Layana, that we don't just have a moment and, oh, this is terrible, and we feel really bad, but how do we really translate that into some kind of concrete, whether it's changes in law enforcement or in legislation or whatever it is? I think that's the toughest question. That is, once we get through this sort of very emotional and the more what we're going through right now, then how do we convert that into something that's meaningful and long lasting? And I mean, we both that you should be an expert on, Ernest, because you work in policy, but I do think that is about policy and not forgetting, not going back to, okay, we have these other things we have to deal with, but keeping on track in the next few months to try to create policy, and hopefully come November have at a federal level a government that actually wants to do something about it.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, trans policies, anti-trans policies have been a hallmark, unfortunately, of this administration since its inception, first in the military, then in education. And so we know that we've been fighting against it. A number of the lawsuits that have been filed have prevented some of the policies that were promoted from being enacted. And yet, when you send the signal from the highest levels that is the policy that is being promoted and desired, it sends a really negative message to the community. And transphobia, if this woman is the one that I'm thinking about, and I believe she is, that was not a racial conflict. That was a community conflict. It was a group of Black people having conflict within the community, and it was transphobia that was at play in that situation. And it is the unfinished work, just like ending the epidemic, transphobia, homophobia, racism. These are all the things. That's why we all have jobs, Alan. We're still
that's right.
We're still at work trying to ensure that the next generation of folks don't have to deal with this crap.
And I do think it puts a spotlight back on just how important this next election is, in that if we are going to have any chance of providing the great power of the federal government and the money that comes with it to change things, we need to change a lot in the federal government, and we need to put into the U.S. Senate people who are committed to being legislators for all of us, not just for a very, very select few. And let's not forget the power they have in appointing judges who are day by day taking rights away from us rather than expanding freedom for all people in the country. They're taking the rights away. So both at the executive level and at the legislative level, this is a very important election. You know,
final thoughts? Well, what are your final thoughts as we close this chat?
Well, I kind of want to go back to what you started out as, that you're exhausted. I'm exhausted. And, we know that often if we look to the people that are our heroes in this area of social change, they never stopped being exhausted, right? They were always exhausted and they never stopped. And I feel like we've got to find, the young folks, they're always talking about self-care, right? And I go like, who has time for self-care? We got to do our work. But it's true. It's really true. We have to find a way to sustain ourselves through these most difficult moments and still have the power, the intellect, the energy to continue, because we're going to have to continue, and I hope some of those young folks who are doing some self-care too will sort of let us sort of take a break in the next few years, right? But I do think that it's going to come down to, in some ways, since we're not going to stop fighting for change, it means that we also need to be able to make this a sustainable, ongoing movement, because we see all around us that there's still a lot of bad shit out there that we need to.
Well, we lost two icons over the last couple of days, last week or so. Ron Simmons, the executive director of Us Helping Us, which is one of the largest Black gay organizations in the country, and Larry Kramer, whose iconic work is the reason that we all kind of are still standing on his shoulders. They both had one thing in common. They both used to say, completely divorced from each other, that they believed that LGBTQ people were the special people sent by God to reform the world and save the world. And I've always loved the fact that they both had that idea, two intellectual giants thinking that particular thought simultaneously has always amused me and inspired me. So that's my thinking. It's been great to talk with you, Alan. Next time over a cocktail.
Yeah, definitely, and and maybe invite some of these people who have been listening in and probably have some deeper thoughts than we have about some of these issues.
Oh, no doubt.
But if they can't join us, then just you and I, that's fine with me too.
That's fine with me too. Bye.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. It's really been an interesting conversation for me to talk with an old friend about these issues, and I hope it was beneficial to those of you that joined us virtually. And so typically,
thank you for supporting our organizations. Thank you.
Yes. We used to say in A's LifeCycle, which I've done a bunch of times, we'd always say end by saying ride safe, but now we can just say be safe and keep working.
Be safe, keep working. Yes, amen.